Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Stefan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of GovLab, and I'm delighted to be the co-moderator of this panel, which is going to focus on data for good and how do we go beyond philanthropy and make data collaboration more systematic, sustainable, and responsible. This is the second in a conversation that we've had with the same group almost exactly a year ago. And we thought it would be useful to reflect on some of the lessons learned of the last year in a similar kind of fashion that we've had last year within the context of the UN World Data Forum. And as I mentioned, the focus is on how do we leverage data for public interest objectives. And obviously, COVID-19 has been a watershed moment in which many more, both from the public and the private sector, have started to appreciate the role that data can play in responding and in the recovery of, for instance, COVID-19 pandemic as well. Today, we're also releasing at Data and Policy, which is a Cambridge University Press journal, a special edition that Richard and together with the GSMA has edited on telephone big data and how it has been used for response to COVID-19. And we have two of the authors, and of course, including Richard as well, part of today's session as well. As I mentioned, the focus will be on how do we make data collaboratives and data for good more systematic, by which we mean going beyond the pilot and the experiments and really starting to think about how do we institutionalize data for good in a more methodological way. We're also looking into how do we make it more sustainable, i.e. what's the business case for data for good initiatives, especially within the context, of course, of official statistics, which is the focus of course, the UN World Data Forum on how do we actually start using privately held data, for instance, for official statistics. And we have, of course, two representing the statistical offices here today on the panel as well. And then third, how do we make it responsible? Because obviously there are risks involved, risks both to those that are data subjects, but also risks to private sector when they start sharing some of those data, including commercial risks and risks with regard to, for instance, reputation. And so how do we make data for good more systematic, sustainable, and responsible? And that's the focus of today. And we will have a few rounds of questions if we get there with all the panelists that in order to unpack some of these issues, but also to really reflect on what have we learned the last year that we need to update our conversation of last year as well. With that, let me give the floor to Richard Benjamins from Telefonica, who is the co-moderator, of course, and co-host of today's session, who will introduce also, first of all, himself, but then also the panelists as such. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and hello to everybody. As Stefan said, I'm Richard Benjamins. I'm the Chief AI and Data Strategist for Telefonica, and also the co-founder of the Observatory of the Social and Ethical Impact of Artificial Intelligence. And with us here in the panel, we have Rachel Sibande from Digital Impact Alliance. We have David Salgado from the Statistics Office in Spain. We have Joanne Stonier from Mastercard, Dominic Roskrut from Statistics of Poland, Hilary Kemp of the GSMA, and Pedro de Alacon, also of Telefonica. Welcome to all of you. I hope we have a very interesting conversation like we had last year. And the first round of questions will be asked by Stefan.
Thanks so much, Richard. And indeed, a pretty distinguished and impressive panel that we brought together today. And first question is to Joanne and to Pedro, which really tries to hone in on the demand for privately held data. And typically, we hear that there is a lot of demand, or we hear that the supply side should make data more accessible without expressing the demand. And so what we hope to learn from both of you, Joanne and Pedro, is what would actually help with regard to expressions of demand in order for instance, Mastercard or Telefonica to be more responsive to some of those solicitations? And so are there some best practices with regard to how the demand for privately held data could be established? And over to you, Joanne.
Sure. So hello, everybody, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to reconvene this group and this discussion. I think that we've come a bit of a way in trying to improve the demand for data from organizations such as mine and Pedro's, but I still think that we have a way to come. I think that many organizations appreciate the power of the information that our organizations collect, but they still come to us with a bit of nascent demand and a misunderstanding of the information that we can share, and some of the regulatory restrictions and some of the other fiduciary duties we have as stewards of data, so that we can't really share raw information, right? And so I think that there's still a gap in the understanding of the type of information we can share, how we can share that information, and how we can do it in an ethical and responsible way. So Mastercard has had a commitment to responsible data sharing for public good and for inclusive growth for quite some time. And so what we've been able to do is try to publish kind of an abstract of what our information is good for. Now, we do not necessarily share our data in raw format, but what we have done is created a series of programs that make our information available to researchers. They can come on board as a data fellow, for example, or they can submit a particular research project. The challenge is that they need to understand what data we actually have, what information we can share. And we're trying to get better and better at creating those profiles so that when we're approached for a study, when we're approached for an initiative, organizations understand what is really our data good for, what kinds of problems and can we really solve, and really what information also do we not have, and what's the best way to partner with us and other organizations in order to really create those solutions. And again, I can't emphasize enough, if you want to use our raw data, you're going to have to come in-house, work closely with my data scientists, and actually do it under observation and under our roof and under our supervision. And that's a very specific lane. If you want information for a study or a project, we're going to need to talk that through and understand, is our data really fit for purpose? And these types of questions, not all organizations have the skill sets to enter into. And that's the other challenge here, right? And we're trying to partner with organizations like data.org to begin to improve the data science in the ecosystem. And I know we're going to touch on that later, so I'll pause here. But I do think that we're seeing that improve slightly, but we still have more to do here. But I'll be interested in hearing how Pedro thinks the environment is changing.
Great. Thanks, Joanne. Pedro, over to you. And also, given the fact that this is the UN World Data Forum that specifically focuses on statistical offices being able to work with organizations like yourself around the data that you have in order to improve statistics, would be interesting to hear from you, Pedro, on, for instance, how can statistical officers improve the way they actually request data, for instance, or signal the need for data, if at all?
Okay, before all, thank you for inviting me to the panel today. It's a pleasure to share with such a distinguished speaker. So I fully support the words by Joanne. We are experiencing the same feelings, the same insights about how the expression on demand could be improved. I think the engagement between the demand side agencies, and in particular with non-government agencies and operators, is still low. It's not progressing as good as we expected like 5 years ago. And we have thought about some actions that could improve the collaboration. Like, for example, we need to work together towards a proper problem definition. Sometimes we are facing projects where there is no clarity about the expectations, the clarity about the questions to be solved or the problem to be solved effectively with data. And that is a general perception, not only in Telefonica, but in the telco industry. So the comment by Joan is very important here. It's very important to understand what kind of data do we need to fit the problem, because sometimes you don't need to provide raw data or mobility matrices, but insights or tools that they can engage or they can insert in a more complex process or in a decision-taking process. So that is a change of mind that we need to promote within demand-side agencies. We have a good experience with the National Statistical Office in Spain because they understand very well what the telco industry can offer. And even better, they understand how they can integrate that information with the gaps they have in census data. I'm sure David will speak about that. I don't want to overlap my speech, but I think national statistical offices nowadays for us are the best performers here, but still we need to work a lot with other agencies. And there are another insights that we need to work on, like creating financially sustainable collaborations. I guess we will discuss later about that, but this is still the stone in the pathway. So we find it again and again. So it is urgent to address it, even during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is not only a global emergency. Such an important event in the last decades, we still find the same problem again and again. And just to finish, I think it's important to establish clear frameworks for data governance between DSAs and telcos and the telco industry. I think many DSAs underestimate the fear, yes, to a potential or privacy incident, or underestimate the limitations of the regulatory frameworks. For example, we are not enabled to profile people. We cannot add variables like gender or age or socioeconomical status to the mobility profiles. We need explicit consent from the users in many countries in Europe to do so. But many DSAs ignore that, and they have higher expectations on what we can actually deliver. So yes, I think well, things are progressing well. Things with national statistical offices, I think they're progressing very well, but still there is a lot of room for improvement here.
Great, thanks so much, Pedro. And you already mentioned the Spanish National Statistics Office, and of course we have David here on the call as well. So immediately over to you, David, but then specifically with a question on how do we institutionalize this function of engaging with the private sector in order to have access, functional access to some of the either data or intelligence, as Joanne was referring to, because obviously this is a new domain, and it does require an understanding, for instance, as Joanne had said, on understanding on anyway, what data is needed for what question, which obviously already exists within the statistical office, but of course now anyway involves external parties as well, and a whole range of additional kinds of concerns and risks. So wondering, David, how do you organize yourself within the Spanish National Statistical Office to engage with the private sector more? And then similar kind of questions for Dominique, who has been, of course, a pioneer in some of those areas as well. Over to you, David.
Yes, thank you very much. I find quite a lot of coincidental points in the analysis of my co-panelists, though obviously I see them from the statistical office point of view, right? So my initial statement is that data management is not to be confused with the production of official statistics which is not to be confused with the use or analysis of official statistics. Just to make a provocative statement, you can have a fully fledged information system with all your metadata perfectly stored and managed, and yet you can have no bit of statistical metadata or metadata for official statistical production purposes, right? So, I mean, this is an extreme statement, but I try to illustrate what I try to say. So, in this sense, the expression data for good or data for social goods, in my view, should be better qualified, because to my best knowledge, data for social good is not official statistics, right? Let me put an example. Let us consider population statistics, right? Official population figures produced by statistical offices all around the planet are used by governments, by national governments, local governments, federal governments, for example, to allocate funds of many kinds, to, for example, classify counties, municipalities, even to distribute the members of parliament according to the territory in a country. And we can be taken to a court of justice if we don't reach some level of standard, quality standards. And this has been the case, for example, in the United States in the past, for example, also in Germany, I think some under definitely some problems. So are data holders and corporations be ready to take responsibility on the statistics they produce for such a kind of statistical outputs? I mean, the dimensions of the problems is different in official statistics that in providing data for social good. So my next step in my line of thought is, okay, then if data for good is not the same as official statistics, we should ask ourselves, when we refer to data for good, are we referring also to official statistics or to some kind of experimental statistics, or just to share some data sets in a very clever and sustainable way? Let me put it again an example coming from the pandemic, which is all these aggregated mobile network data sets that the companies have produced with a lot of effort. They should be proud of the result. This has been completely useful to a lot of health agencies around the world. You have the case of, you can read any of the articles of the special issue by Richard Benjamin and by her colleague in the GSMA. But I state that these aggregated mobile network data sets cannot be used to produce official statistics, for example, on mobility or on population statistics, because there is a higher stringent demand on the quality. This does not mean that these data sets are not useful. I'm stating rather the contrary, that we are facing much more problems if we want to reach the standards that official statistics need to meet. So in this way, I think we have arranged in this concept of data for social good, going from just sharing data to the whole production of highly quality official statistics. And in this sense, I think that official statistics, at least in the context of the European statistical system, I'm a member of the task forces on big data and on mobile network data. I think that we all agree that this is absolutely promising, that society must take into account all these big data sources, but there are still some issues to be solved. My colleagues have already pointed out some of them, that we need to collaborate, and even before considering the question about data access, we need to share our knowledge, we need to share metadata to see what we can get for the data. For example, in the case of mobile network data, which is an extremely complex data ecosystem with a very entangling technology underlying the whole system, certainly for our purposes, we don't need every single bit that you can find there. We need to detect exactly what we need to reach a certain amount of accuracy and certain amount of timeliness. Then we need to share all this knowledge. We have been working on proposing some end-to-end statistical processes, but we need to collaborate together. We need to talk, not even talking with about the data themselves, but the metadata. And in this line, I absolutely share the view that the question about the cost, about the resources that these big data sources entail have to be tackled somehow. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, David, and thanks for making that overview that indeed there is a wide spectrum of products, and that like official statistics is of course at the one extreme of level of quality and expectations, and that we need to, I guess, have an understanding of on what spectrum can progress be made. Over to you, Dominique. I'm sure you have a whole range of similar kind of observations, but also, Dominique, would be interesting, coming back to my question again, is that even what David was referring to, does this require kind of a distinctive kind of new function or a new kind of institutional response to even have this kind of understanding of how do we assess metadata within, for instance, telecom environments as well. But over to you, Dominique.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much for inviting me. I feel very honored to be part of this panel. For me, this is just a fundamental question on the role of the official statistics in the changing information ecosystem. And there are a few things I wanted to say, trying to address the question that you've pointed out to me, at the end. First thing, data for good. Data for good is what official statistics was designed for, and of course we will never cover all the activities and the products with our products as well, whatever is possible. And we understand that there is a growing role in the ecosystem for other partners as well. I think that the most basic information or the information that might never come out of the business sector, like the climate change 30 years ago, it was not in an interest of the business sector. This is a role for the official statistics to have a right and to have a obligation to kind of come up with the information that is necessary to sustain democratic processes in the country. That's very important role. But of course, in the context of the avalanche of the new data sources and opportunities, I mean, it's very important that we do not leave statistical offices behind, not letting them to do the things that might be possible today, in according with their kind of like initial design, their DNA of producing these kind of public information that are necessary for us to sustain our existence. As I said, we are probably not going to do everything on the market, but we are the foundation. And believe me, others need this foundation to build upon it an effective and efficient data ecosystem. And this is the role of the official statistics. And to some degree, this is not a new role. I mean, we've been supposed to be kind of like, I would call it data stewardship office in the past, though our founding fathers didn't use this language because, everything was a little bit different. The language that we used was a public information infrastructure, but it's really a good term as well. I mean, public information infrastructure. Not only kind of like just feeding public with the data or statistics that we need to sustain democratic processes, but also facilitating data flows and reuse of the data by other stakeholders. This was the role initially thought, even though the amount of data was far smaller than what we have today. But that what was already, emphasized at the advent of the knowledge-based economy, that there was this role, and we were to, facilitate the growth of knowledge-based economy at that time. Again, there are similar, ideas, though the language that has been used in the past is a little bit different, I would say. But anyway, we are very well prepared to have this function to some degree, to some degree play an important kind of a role as a data steward, facilitating the growth of the data ecosystem, like we were to grow the knowledge-based economy. We have standards, specifications, definitions, we have metadata repositories, and we extend them beyond our premises. Like for example, in Poland, we have a repository of all the more than 600 registers in public information systems, and everything is perfectly described, and you can dive into and see what's available there. However, there are obstacles and limitations that we need to kind of like address at the moment, especially in legislation and regulation, both of statistical systems and but also other parts of the government, and specific legislation deeply regulating operations of our major business stakeholders, like telecoms. That's very important. Then of course we need openness of businesses to cooperate with the public sector in a common interest. And of course there's a question to us how we define this role precisely for official statistics. There's a new United Nations working group that I had a privilege to co-chair with my colleagues from Colombia, which deals exactly with the issue of definition of what the data stewardship means for the official statistics. But just to address your question precisely, I think that we all need, new resources in terms of human resources that will be capable of, helping us to really flourish all these new roles and all these new directions of development. And this is a new profile of competencies that we should kind of like build, namely the competencies needed for being a data steward. I mean, at a personal level. So, and we like those. There are not too many people, that can play this role nowadays, and it's not only about being data scientists, being able to write complicated algorithms. It also is about being someone who is a knowledge capable and understand data ecosystems per se. So, and not only in the premises of official statistics, but also everywhere else in the data ecosystem. This will help everyone. So I think this is a very important issue. But again, I will always stress, because it's a fundamental question to me, and I'm of course biased. I like this term even. So because I'm a statistician, so I'm biased toward official statistics. But I think that we all need it, no matter where we want to go. Thank you.
Thanks, Dominic, and thanks for being biased, because I think it provides for a clear message here as well. And over to Hilary and Rachel, and I think Dominic was already referring to the crucial role, anyway, to nurture this kind of data ecosystem, and so wondering. For you, Hilary, you of course have more of a bird's eye view on what's happening in the data ecosystem, especially from a GSMA point of view. And Rachel, you also have this kind of more enabling kind of role around the data ecosystem. So wondering from you, what are some of the elements that you have felt the last year have been successful towards nurturing a more systematic, sustainable, and responsible kind of data ecosystem, and what do you feel are some priority areas moving forward?
So I'll go first, if that's okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this very expert panel. Hopefully I can do justice to it by giving the viewpoint from the GSMA. This last year has been very much influenced in the work that we've done by the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's shown a kind of an accelerated version of work that's gone on in the past, applying data to social good challenges. And the kind of urgency, I guess, of the global health emergency drove this. And it's seen countries going from zero use of what I would call alternative data sources, so things like mobile network operator data, to creating sort of data dashboards that have informed decision making in a short period of time. And in some cases, these countries, governments and public sector organizations were harnessing sort of data analytics as well in this way for the very first time too. So what we have seen happening in order to enable this is the creation of collaborative teams that pull together public and private sector organizations, so the suppliers of data and analytics and the users of it, Plus, of course, the regulatory data privacy expertise as well to ensure that responsible data practices are being followed. Because as we all know, trust is a really important factor in the way that these kind of projects are run. So forming a kind of a core team of key people in this data ecosystem has proved to be an important first step. Another thing that we found as well during this period of time was that co-creating solutions was an effective way to work. So jointly defining and prioritizing use cases that address the challenges, the problems, particularly sort of health and social challenges when it came to COVID. And then rapidly building basic products. Again, I use the dashboard example to explore what the data could tell everybody about the problem, and also refine the way it's presented so that it acts as a really genuinely good aid to decision making. And then iteratively adding new functionality, extending it to cover additional use cases. And by working in this way, with this very kind of tight but cross-functional group of people, it built transparency, an understanding of data and the insights it could give, and a level of trust in the robustness and representativeness as well. And in parallel with this intense work in the core team, there was also a lot of capacity building that was going on as well with the wider set of stakeholders and decision makers that sit around this kind of core group of people who are applying data in this way. And I guess that for me, some of the interesting things about this has been that the result has been, I think, a significant increase in the public sector government exposure to data analytics and some of the applications in a real operational setting as well, not just as a sort of a standalone technical pilot that's going on somewhere within the business. And it's kind of provoked the start of an interest in adopting analytics more widely. Because it's been experienced, the usefulness in particular situations has now been seen. And importantly, I guess there's also an understanding of what it needs to put it into place. So to make good use of analytics and to a certain extent AI. It's not just technical infrastructure and data science expertise, but also sort of impacts wider processes, skills, training that accompany it. And this has resulted, I think, in an appreciation of what's involved in implementing data-driven decision-making, the barriers and the costs, but also the benefits. And I just wanted to kind of sum up my little response here by saying that this work has been captured in a number of places, including a report from an FCDO funded project that Dial as well as GSMA have contributed to, and that report's on the GSMA website, but also, of course, the papers that have been published as part of this Data and Policy Journal Special Edition, which include quite a lot of these same sort of findings and experiences about what's actually gone on within countries across the world to apply data analytics to this particular global challenge.
Great. Thanks so much, Hilary. Over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Stephanie and Hilary, for those early insights. So from the perspective of the Digital Impact Alliance, we're set up to be a think, do, replicate tank. And what we have seen in the last year is indeed, as a think, do, replicate tank, is that most of the data models, the tools and resources that we have developed and deployed in over 9 countries across 3 use cases have actually taken shape and created a demand for replication. For example, for our work in Malawi, we have seen that the data models that we had invested in partnership with the mobile network operator, the regulatory authority, and the Ministry of Health are being replicated to develop COVID-19 risk and epidemiological models in response to the pandemic. We've also seen that the investments that we've made in open source technology solutions and models for analyzing mobile network data, for example, through partners such as Flowminder and Opal, being used in countries like Haiti, Colombia, Senegal, places where the Digital Impact Alliance does not necessarily work in. I think this is fundamental for us because that's what success looks like. And that's what, data for good looks like in a systematic manner, where there are models and tools that can be used by other data for development practitioners in other geographies without necessarily our involvement. I think the last example that I could also give of what we have seen is national statistical offices stepping up to become stewards, data stewards for these data for good initiatives. A typical example is in Malawi, where we had initially supported a health post deployment use case to help the Ministry of Health to make better decisions of where to deploy new health posts across the country. Because at the time, only about 45% of the country's population was living within a 5-kilometer radius to health facility. But interestingly now, the country has set up its first Data for Development Technical Working Group. It's a collection of both public and private sector stakeholders who are intending to work together to leverage the use of data for decision-making across other use cases beyond the pilot use case in health that we had supported. So they are looking into how to leverage the use of data for education use cases, for example, placement of schools or placement of water points, or indeed in agriculture. So we're seeing a lot of demand and interest from institutions like national statistic offices to become data stewards and to institutionalize the use of these data for good initiatives across the board. Lastly, I think as a key takeaway, we've learned in the last year that it's very important as entities plan and design data for good initiatives, if at all aiming for systematic delivery, to plan for replication, to plan for scale and institutionalization of these data for good initiatives much early on, rather than thinking through these aspects as an afterthought. And I say this because we've seen examples of one of our implementing partners, Cooper Smith, who have now taken on the initiative to replicate some of the models of COVID-19 risk and epidemiological data models that they did in Malawi for replication for countries that are under the Western Africa Health Organization. As you can see, this shows that there's an opportunity actually to leverage tools, models that already exist in these data for good initiatives across other geographies, across other development sectors without necessarily having to reinvent the wheel. These are some of the things that we've learned in terms of what is really working and acting as an enablers in making data for good initiatives more systematic. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and thanks everyone for this first round. We already touched on a whole range of issues, so I leave it up to you, Richard, to take it wherever you want to take it, following all the earlier insights we've heard. And also for those who want to ask questions on the WOVA app, feel free to put the questions in the question box there. We already have like 5 questions, which we will address later on, or try to address later on as well. Over to you, Richard.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan. Given time, we have only 20 minutes left, so I would like to ask you if you can reply in like 1 minute in the next round. This round will be on questions about the financial sustainability of data for good initiatives, and also about responsibility in the process of sharing. We mentioned already this special collection for the Data and Policy Journal. We did some qualitative analysis on that of all the countries that were analyzed and described. And coming back to what Rachel also said about data stewards and ONS, what we saw that in the different papers, it was about even the representation of NSOs as an intermediate organization. There were also some third-party companies that had this role. In some cases, there were actually specific NGOs who did that, but also sometimes industries or universities. So there is not a specific trend that one organization is moving in a certain area, but it's still open. I think everybody is still exploring, and it depends very much on specific situations. Now, the first question is about financial sustainability. Now, again, we looked at the papers in this, the experiences in this special issue, actually, we found that almost 70% of all the initiatives that were mentioned were pro bono. So there was no commercial contract behind. In one, there was a commercial contract, one of the initiatives in the Nordics. And there were like 3 initiatives that were funded externally, like the Hewlett-Packard Foundation or those kind of philanthropical discussions. So majority still pro bono. And so this question is how to make this sustainable. Yeah, the first question of this round. So I would like to ask first Pedro, then Rachel, then Dominic, and then Hillary to give their 1 minute pitch on how do we make this sustainable from a financial perspective. Pedro.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, so good news is that we have 1 minute, but I must say that within the Big Data for Social Good working group at the GSMA, we've been working together, I think about around 70 operators in order to define and to analyze what sustainable business models are best fitting our objectives towards data for good. And the result was a report published on the web called, the name of the report is Scaling Big Data for Social Good. It's available. We support every word contained in that report. Basically, we analyze the 5 main business models behind these projects. One is philanthropy, pro bono, Richard already mentioned, donor subsidized, crop subsidized, tier models, and commercial models. We experience all these models along these 5 years running social good projects. And I think the best ones, the best who show more social impact and more long-term sustainability are the tier model and the commercial model. The tier model was the one we experienced several times along the COVID pandemic. It's about giving a free trial-based experience with some elements paid for or postponed payment. But the commercial model with probably discounted price is showing more effective in order to align with this long-term sustainability criteria that we are putting together. And also, but it's also had many positive side effects. I won't enter here in the details. I really encourage you to take a look to that report, Scaling Big Data for Social Good.
Thank you very much, Pedro. And we go over to Rachel.
Thanks. I think 3 quick points to meet the 1 minute. Number 1 is it's important to fund the institutionalization of data capacity and use within and across governments. We've seen a lot of siloed and fragmented funding initiatives within the data for good space. And so it's important that we shift from a siloed sectoral initiatives approach to aligning most of these data for good initiatives with national priorities. Just also to intimate there that it's very critical to fund digital capacity as a whole and not just siloed projects. Lastly, it's key to enhance collaboration with the private sector and in particular mobile network operators, but also telecommunication regulatory authorities, among others, to create core shared value models where there is benefit both for the telcos, but also for the public sector entities. This would ensure that projects are funded and sustained in the longer term. Lastly, we've also seen a lot of data for good initiatives and data for development models that have been tested. It would be good to ensure that we are replicating and scaling up what has already worked elsewhere in other industries, sectors, or geographies, rather than solely funding new approaches within the government itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And we go over to Dominic.
Thank you very much. And another question of sustainability is another fundamental question. It reminds me about my first lectures at the university when I was a student, about national income product counts and the circular flow in between businesses and individuals with the public sector in the background, and how to kind of like trigger everything in order to make it work, and I can tell you one thing, capital markets force companies to be for profit. That let's not be misleaded, that they are for profit, and of course they may kind of like engage in any kind of like all these initiatives for a short time for the issues of communication and whatever similar to that. But it's not that I would just, this is nothing that I would assess to be a sustainable. Of course, this is not bad that the companies do that, but we need to keep things clear. Private and public DNA are fundamentally different. And that's why this question is so much important, because we need to, bridge somehow all these gaps and make the whole system to work, what we shall do actually might be interesting for you to know that we are now working in the expert group, established by the European Commission on the new data sources for official statistics, and we are actually arguing for some kind of a solutions. Like I can mention a few of them so that you have the image of how our thinking is going at the moment. We need to acknowledge the principle that official statistics represents public good. That's for sure. That's the first and that's fundamental thing. And then introduce some kind of principles that data holders under specific conditions and subject to a number of safeguards are required to collaborate with statistical authorities. That's the second point. But of course, we need to acknowledge the principle that data holders should not be subject to unreasonable burden and constraints, and guarantee the effective implementation of the safeguards, conditions, and limitations surrounding the reuse of the data for official statistics for all the stakeholders, including our users of our offices. And of course, what comes in the background, there's a lot of safeguards and things that have to be, done and prepared because of the, security, privacy, confidentiality, these things which are very important, that have been always very important. But in terms of the new technological solutions, we need to also kind of like adjust our preparation to that level. And of course, the quality assurance frameworks, we have them, we had them for ages in the official statistics, but they have to be somehow developed to tackle with these new data sources as well. But then when we ultimately agree on some kind of a level of cooperation in this mode, I would be very happy. And that's what we are trying to argue for. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dominique. And lastly, we go to Hillary. 1 minute.
Right. So yes, hearing all of the things that have been said already, I guess I wanted to pick up on a dimension, which is if we are agreed that to make things sustainable, there needs to be some element of budget and investment. Often finding the new budget to go with the new data source is one of the key problems. And I think one of the areas I think that there probably needs to be more thought about is how does that get justified if there is money that's put aside for using an alternative data source? What is it that constitutes that business case, that justification for creating a new budget pot as well, and looking more closely at the impact that this data analytics has, the benefits, and being able to quantify those in some way, whether that's faster decision making, using more timely data, or the ability to optimize and possibly automate parts of existing processes, or many other things. And the other comment I will very quickly make in my probably about 10 seconds left is it's also really important to think about the business model right at the early stage as well of a project. It's not something that can be tacked on afterwards. And if a lot of thought goes into, again, what's benefiting as a result of the use of this data analytics, be they official statistics or through to some of the more action-oriented social good projects, putting thought into a business model and how all of the partners could work together sustainably long term is really important at the early stage rather than at the end.
Thank you very much, Hillary. In the same line of this question, I guess all of you are aware of the upcoming Data Act of the European Commission, where they actually want to regulate business to government and business to business data sharing. Yeah, so I think that's a very relevant discussion. It's still in preparation, but it's going to be very important, and therefore I think next year we will have a very maybe different conversation. Now, in the interest of time, we have only 9 minutes left. Rather than going to the last question, maybe we can, Stefan, you can take some questions from the audience if there are, and then ask the panelists that were supposed to answer the last question to answer those questions.
Yes, there are some. Thanks so much, Richard. There are indeed some questions in the chat here or the Q&A, and perhaps that's a question for Joanne. Indeed, anyway, building upon what Richard was already referring to with regard to the avalanche of policy instruments that are being prepared, whether you see developments going in the right direction. Basically, that's one of the questions that was posed as well. And of course, that might be a hard question for you, Joanne, but perhaps you could define what would be the right direction, and without evaluating whether it goes that direction. But obviously, there's a lot happening, and I think that's something that, on the one hand, is kind of positive. Is that this is not a conversation among only a few. This has become more mainstream discussion, and so it would be interesting to get your sense, Joanne, on what would be like an ideal scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly I've been part of this conversation for quite a while, and so what is encouraging is we have many more participants in the conversation, and I think that which is very positive, and I think you're hearing the outcome of that in today's publication in the journal. And I think you're hearing from many of my fellow panelists some of the common practices that we're beginning to tease out, whether that is a commitment of a cohort of individuals who have to concentrate on the practices in this area, whether you're hearing that we have to understand the questions that we're trying to ask and answer with data, and or the role of the statistical offices in being that kind of governmental office for data for positive social impact, right, and data for good, and perhaps being that government office that can be a center of best practice within a government. I think we still have quite a ways to go. I don't think that we have solved everything yet, and I think that there's still quite a bit of work that we need to do as connected ecosystems related to how data flows and the data that we need to keep in mind. Oftentimes, we still have to think about the impact on the individuals that we're trying to solve the problems for. And I think that's been a little bit absent from our conversation today. And so I'm going to bring that back around because it was part of the last question, and it's implied in a few in the responsible practices and how data can be used for social impact. So many times the questions that we're trying to solve, and we talked a little bit about COVID, and COVID has become such a phenomenon from a health crisis, a social crisis, an economic crisis. But it really does come back down to that we're trying to solve this for individuals. And we use the word privacy a lot. But the reality is that almost every project for social impact has to do with individuals. And I think we still need to protect those individuals when they have given various organizations their information, their data. How do we share that in a way that when we're resharing it, whether it's even to a statistical office, how does an individual understand that it's going to be positive for them at the end of the day? And how do we do that in a way that honors that privacy? And how do we do that in a way that's secure? We haven't talked about that today. And I think we don't have all those secure mechanisms figured out yet. I don't think we understand exactly how we make sure every party in the ecosystem is accountable for the steps in the ecosystem. I don't know how we're transparent, right? These are all principles that I think we all have to align around. I still think we want to have integrity. We haven't talked about AI, right? And the advent of AI, and we haven't talked about the minimization of bias and how we have more inclusive data sets, which is another whole panel that we would need to talk about, right? And then how do we make sure that we are doing the right things around innovation and around positive social impact? And again, all these topics have been touched upon today. So I think we are going in the right direction, Stefan, to answer the question that's posed to us. But there's many, many more things that I think all of us would agree still need to be addressed. And that I think that the good news is there are more hands doing this work. There's still a question as to who should be the party leading this. And I think that's one of the reasons for the EU law. And I still worry, though, that the governmental sector will try to force this question when there's an awful lot of institutions that need to, that have stewardship responsibilities, whether that's academia, whether that's the private sector, whether it is NGOs that service different communities. And I think we have to look at that. And then there's also context inside the data itself, whether it's health data or financial data and educational data. How do we navigate those things? So and climate data. I think there's still work there. So I'll stop here, but those are some of my initial thoughts to that question.
Thanks, Joanne. And David, one of the questions, and I don't know, Richard, if you could answer in 1 minute, and then Richard, I will give the floor to you again to round up this session, which has been tremendously insightful from my point of view, and indeed, indicates that we're making progress. Each time when we meet, there are some new insights that we have learned and some new developments that are going into the right direction. But one question to you, David, that was also in the Q&A was, are there some use cases for tapping into telecom data, for instance, that you would like to see develop more? Of course, there are, you have stepped up here with Telefonica and others in order to leverage telephone data for a variety of purposes, but are there some use cases that you say, look, this is realizing, of course, that we're not talking per se about official statistics, perhaps, but, or at least, anyway, we're talking about this spectrum here. Are there some use cases that you would like to see more of? 1 minute, if feasible.
Yeah, 1 minute. Indeed, one of the objectives of the task forces and the development in the European statistical system is to identify these business cases. So far, we have clearly identified any kind of population figures, the commuting statistics for urban planning, but we also have any kind of tourism statistics, just to know how tourists move so that you can provide accurate information. We are trying also to unravel more possible business cases. But as Pedro said, we need to talk more closely to identify it in the data ecosystem what kind of information can we be using all these advanced analytics so that we can clearly state the business case in each case. I mean, our goal is to think of all the statistical domains in a statistical office and make a thorough revision to see what the impact of this big data source in each of these statistical domains.
Great. Over to you, Richard, for the easy task to summarize and close this in 1 minute.
Okay, so indeed we have 1 minute. So thank you everybody for being here. I think we've seen a lot of progress in the last year, but we've also seen a lot of challenges that are still ahead of us that we have to work on. And one thing that came out very clearly is that this is a multi-party conversation. And I think the fact that we are here today, we are governments, we are statistics offices, we are the private sector with companies, with industry associations, we are NGO here, and we have also academics. So I think this is the way to go forward. So we need to talk to each other, we need to understand each other, and that's the only way we can make this work. So, and that's, I would like to close with that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.